16th, 1997, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, US President Bill Clinton is apologising.
I am sorry.
Among the group of 7 men who is apologising to, 95-year-old Herman Shaw.
I'm saddened today to think of those who did not survive and whose families will forever live with the knowledge that their death and suffering was preventable.
In 1932, in the darkest days of the Great Depression, Herman Shaw was a 30-year-old farmer growing cotton, corn and turnip greens on the family's acreage near Tallahassee, Alabama. He was married with 2 small children and struggling to put food on the table. Herman couldn't believe his luck when he was given a flyer advertising free medical care.
Free blood test, free treatment by county health department and government doctors. You may feel well and still have bad blood. Come and bring all your family.
Herman Shaw was one of 600 African-American men who signed up at the local church. Every month they got blood tests and were given aspirin and tonics for their bad blood. Once a year, they received a full medical examination. Many endured excruciating spinal taps, and then they were sent away with a free meal. What they didn't know was they were a part of a medical experiment being conducted by the US Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control, based at the Tuskegee Institute just down the highway. Of the 600 black men given free treatment, almost 2/3 had syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease which begins as a few sores or a rash and years later can cause damage to the heart and other organs and in some cases lead to dementia, blindness and death. In the early 1930s, the disease was rampant in impoverished areas like rural Alabama, with about 35% of adults infected. None of those 399 men were told they had syphilis. None of them were treated with effective panaceas. None of their families were ever warned, and none consented to take part in what is now known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. As far as scientists were concerned, it was a great success.
It promises to be the most illuminating investigation of its type yet undertaken, an outstanding contribution to the literature.
By then, it had been discovered that the antibiotic penicillin cured syphilis, but the experiment continued. The men still didn't know they were sick, and they were not given penicillin. By then, more than 1/3 of the infected men had died. Others were put in asylums because of their dementia. In 1957, the surviving men were given a certificate and $25, $1 for each year of their so-called treatment. It wasn't until July 1972 that the truth was revealed by Associated Press reporter Jean Heller. It made the front page of the New York Times but was overshadowed by news about the Vietnam War and the presidential election. It was only then the Tuskegee men were told if they had syphilis. In his 70th year, Herman Shaw was told he did, although he'd never had symptoms. He didn't know how he'd caught it. He may have been born with it. His mother died when he was just 3. Congress investigated and victims were paid around $10,000 each in compensation. But it took another quarter of a century for an American president to say he was sorry.
What was done cannot be undone. But we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful.
Indeed, it was, yet survivors like Herman Shaw showed remarkable grace.
I wish to thank Mr. President Clinton. Thank you very much for inviting us to the White House. It has been over 65 years since we entered the program. We are delighted today to close this very tragic and painful chapter in our lives.
Shaw died 2 years later, buried in the county he'd been born in 97 years earlier, but the chapter had not really closed. As Vice President Al Gore noted, the Tuskegee experiment had far-reaching consequences for many African Americans. In particular, it destroyed their trust in medical science and the government itself.
It was a disgraceful episode for American science. We feel the repercussions still. Tremors of distrust that have not yet disappeared. To this day, the Tuskegee Study makes some Americans think twice about donating blood or taking their children for vaccinations or signing an organ donor card.
Informed consent is now required for any medical trial, test or procedure in the United States, including the COVID vaccine. But for some, it is still not reassurance enough.